Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the video. In this video, I'm going to give you some introductory thoughts and discussion on Homer's The Iliad. In particular, we're spending 2 days on it. On day one, we are reading parts of book one as well as parts of book six. Of course, as you know, parts from book one are in your shorter edition, and the parts from book six are in the PDF that I provided you. So just a little bit about that. So to get us started, if you saw the video last week, on the ancient Greeks, the introduction to the ancient Greeks, I told you a little bit about the mythology behind the Iliad, but I figured why not just talk about it again really quick. So if you remember, the Iliad starts, it's about the great Trojan War, right? The Trojan War is part of the, it's part of classical mythology, and it takes place as the mythology of both the Greeks and the Romans, as we shall see in a few weeks. But the Trojan War starts because of just some petty bet that the Greek goddesses had amongst themselves. You had Hera, who was Zeus's wife. You had Athena, the goddess of wisdom, and you had Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty. They all had a contest to say which of us is the most desirable. We're going to get some random mortal guy to say who is the most desirable among all of us. Well, they find Paris, who is a shepherd in Troy. Of course, come to find out, Paris is actually one of King Priam's, sons, who was a he's one of Priam's sons who was given up at birth because of prophecy. But Paris, of course, being the man he is, chose Aphrodite, right, who is the goddess of beauty and sex, right, Aphrodite. So she grants him as his prize the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Troy. Because Helen is the wife of King Menelaus, who is one of the many kings in Greece, one of the kings of the many city-states in Greece. And this kicks off the entire Trojan War. So once the Iliad starts, sort of almost in the middle of the war, we get, we are introduced early on to the character of Achilles. So before I get to talking about the characters, let me just talk for a few minutes about the form of the Iliad, which is the epic poem. So the epic poem is written the way that epic poems are written. They're written in what's called hexameter, meaning they're pretty along the lines of poetry. But as you notice, that the Iliad isn't rhymed necessarily. It was written. It's written down in a way, but that's meant to be recited, right? It's written in this sort of sing-song type of way, and the ancient Greek poets, memorized this as a way of public performance. Back in ancient Greece, they didn't have Netflix to keep them entertained, so these poets memorized, these great legends. Of course, the Iliad is attributed to a poet named Homer. But as I mentioned to you before, I don't think Homer probably wasn't a real guy, right? He was claimed to be this blind poet, but Homer is probably many poets over a long history of time. But the poem was written in a way that's meant to be recited, meant to be performed. It was performed for generations before it was actually written down. So epics tend to have a lot of conventions. We're going to read several epics in the course. We're going to start with the Iliad. We're going to do some of the Aeneid, the great Roman epic. We're going to do parts of Dante's Inferno, as well as a lot of Paradise Lost. So the epic is an important form that we're going to be covering. Well, usually in an epic, we have one of the main conventions is larger than life characters. Okay, larger than life characters. Quite literally, in the case of the Iliad, we have our two main heroes of the story. Achilles is on the Greek side. As you see, Achilles is a demigod. Right? Achilles is the son of Thetis, who is sort of one of the maidens of the sea. And so Achilles is a demigod. And the legend goes that Achilles is pretty much invincible, right? No one can beat him on the field of battle. He has it easy because he's pretty much a demigod. But at his birth, Achilles was bathed, as a young child in this water that made him invulnerable. But the only part of his body that wasn't made vulnerable was his heel, right? The Achilles heel. Actually, the legend goes that Paris is the one who finally does kill Achilles by shooting an arrow, sort of without honor, into his heel. Of course, that story, weirdly enough, isn't in the Iliad, right? That's later stories about the Trojan War. But interestingly enough, that's the case. So we have this guy Achilles, who's one of our larger-than-life characters. We also get Hector, the character of Hector, who is the hero on the Trojan side, who is also a sort of larger-than-life character. Achilles, arguably, maybe more so. And so we have these two characters. Usually in an epic, these characters have what is called hubris. 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 And hubris, by definition, is this sort of overbearing quality. Right? These characters have these overbearing sorts of qualities. For Achilles, we'll also get this for later in Paradise Lost, when we talk about the character of Satan. But Achilles' hubris is his overarching pride. Of course, as you guys probably noticed early, King Agamemnon takes a consort. He takes a concubine as the spoils of war. And it's one of Apollo's, the god of sun's servants. Well, Apollo forces a plague on the Greeks, of wanting to give his servant's daughter back. And Agamemnon says, okay, I'll do it, so long as I can take Achilles as prize instead. So Achilles kind of starts off the whole epic. He gets his feelings hurt, right, because his pride is hurt in the fact that his spoils of war get taken away by the king. Agamemnon's sort of the king ruler of them all. Right? He's the main ruler. So Achilles says, okay, I'm not going to fight anymore. I'm going to sit in the corner and pout until, whenever you say that you need me most, I'm not going to be there for you because you have slighted me. So Achilles doesn't take that in stride, and as a result, that creates much of the conflict in the poem. So Achilles' overarching pride. Of course, as you can guess, he's probably going to be back in the second half of the story. Something's going to happen to cause Achilles to come back. So watch out for that. But he does have an over excessive amount of pride. Of course, you can always ask yourself, is pride that bad of a thing? All right, he knows his worth. Why shouldn't he showcase his worth? So that's something to consider as well. But our other great hero is Hector, right? Who is the hero on the Trojan side. One of the prompts that you're going to actually get is which character is the more heroic. Does it seem like Hector to you? Does it seem like Achilles to you? But Hector was much different than Achilles, in the sense that he seems to be the more human of the two men. I gave you guys this selection from book 6 because it gives us a lot of insight into Hector's character, who he is, what makes him tick, why is he heroic. We learn that Hector comes home from the war. He first seeks out Paris and scolds Paris for not being outside fighting in the battle. When, of course, Helen of Troy kind of comes on to Hector a little bit right there as well. My Paris is so worthless. Won't you sit down and rest a while, Hector? Right? I wonder what the subtext is there. But of course, Hector turns down the most beautiful woman in the world and goes home to his wife Andromache, and their son. One of the most famous moments in the whole poem is in book 6 when Hector sees his young baby. When after Andromache is like, "Please, Hector, stop fighting. I don't want to be left as a widow." Right? It's on page 253 of our PDF. Hector pretty much says, "Sorry, I can't abandon my men, right? I have honor. I can't abandon my men like a coward." And then the famous passage after that is on 254. With these words, respondent Hector reached for his child, who shrank back screaming into his nurse's bosom, terrified of his father's bronze-encased face and the horse-chair plume he saw nodding down from the helmet's crest. This forced a laugh from his father and mother, and Hector removed the helmet from his head and set it on the ground all shimmering with light. Then he kissed his dear son and swung him up gently and said a prayer to Zeus and the other immortals. So this passage does a lot of work in just showing Hector's overall humanity. Right? It shows his sort of tender interaction with his wife Andromache. He says he hopes he's dead. He says he figures that the Trojans are going to lose the war, but despite that, he can't turn his back from his men. And he hopes that he's dead long before Andromache gets taken captive and becomes a slave. Pretty dire things here, right? We're probably going to lose, but I still can't turn my back. But at the same time, he also showcases his humanity, right? He shows here that he's a family man. Whenever we talk about Western literature, family is something that is an important value in our Western tradition, right? The value of family. Hector kind of has this nice, tender moment with his son here, right? Whereas his little infant son is scared at how terrifying he looks with his war helmet on. But he takes his war helmet off, and then it causes a nice little laugh, nice tender moment. So that's a little bit into Hector's character, right? He too has honor, he too has pride, but he also has all these other values. So you might ask yourself, well, the Iliad is a poem written by the Greeks. So why is this guy Hector? Why isn't he overly villainous? Why is he too humanized? Well, that's a great question. It brings up a lot of ambiguity, right? Who is the right side here? Is it the Greeks? Is it the Trojans? Are both sides at fault to an extent? These are questions that the poem raises. So that's a bit about those two characters. But we might ask ourselves, what are some overall major themes? What are the big ideas that this epic poem interrogates? Well, one of the ideas is, of course, war, right? The futility of war. Why do people fight in these wars? You're going to see more of that when we read the next section. But even today, at the beginning of book 6, before we get to Hector, we have the passage with Glaucus and Diomedes, right? They have the whole exchange, talking about their family lineages, and come to find out that their fathers were actually friends. So these two guys on the polar opposite end of the war says, well, we don't suppose we can kill each other or fight each other because we have lots of history. So it seems a little bit of absurd. These two manly warriors, and they're like, well, we can't fight each other because our family have been friends. But this is a case where it shows again, the futility of war, perhaps the meaninglessness of war. We have all these bodies sort of adding up at the beginning because of the curse that's being put upon the Greeks. But lots of just senseless violence in this poem. The poem glorifies these warriors to an extent, but at the same time, it also showcases how awful and devastating war can be too. I mean, Hector's interaction with Andromache, I hope you don't become a slave, after the war is over. Of course, you guys know the history. Andromache is taken as a pretty much a sex slave, and their infant son, his head is bashed in. So yeah, nice. How nice, right? So the futility of war is a great theme. Another great theme here is the role of the gods. Right? I talked to you guys in the ancient Greek introduction video. The ancient Greek gods aren't always nice. We don't know what their motivations are a lot of the time. We don't know what inspires them. These humans in the battle seem to be playthings to their little squabbles that they have going on. We have early in the poem gods taking sides, right? Apollo, the god of the sun, he seems to be taking the Trojan side in the war. We have Athena, who is the goddess of wisdom. She is always, of course, on the Greek side. Hera, her mother, is also on the Greek side. Zeus is trying to kind of sit on the fence, right? Zeus is a fan of Hector, and of course Thetis goes and asks Zeus to take revenge on the Greeks for them wronging Achilles. Zeus is like, well, I don't really want my wife to nag me about it, so let's just keep it on the down low for now. So Zeus is kind of sitting on the fence, not wanting to take a side in this war. So you see a lot of what's going on. The people are just petty playthings. They're like little action figures for the gods. So in this case, does that add to the heroism of different people in the war, right? Or are they just being controlled by the gods? This is something to ask yourself and consider. Right? is a person heroic if they're being controlled on a puppet string by God? You guys are going to see lots of different battles in the next section where that very thing is raised. Right? Is Achilles really that heroic if he can't die? Arguably so, arguably not. These are the questions that we raise. So the role of the gods is something to consider. But also, of course, the role of families, the role of friends. We have the treatment of women in the poem. The one instance from Book 6 that I gave you today is one of the few instances where Helen of Troy is actually talked about. Helen is kind of a victim here, right? She can't help it that she was manipulated by the gods to fall in love with Paris, but that's just how it happened. She might have even stayed with with King Menelaus if it wasn't for the gods meddling. So we have lots of interesting women in the poem, right? We have Andromache, we have Hecuba, who is Hector's mother. We have the concubine characters who sort of don't have a voice, right? We have Briseis, who is taken from Achilles, but we never really get their perspective, right? They're being exchanged almost like they're cattle, right? So that's something to consider. Whenever we talked about the ancient Greeks and the role of women, and how are they being portrayed? Helen is even, I kind of gave you a sympathetic portrayal of Helen just a second ago, but in the poem that I gave you today, she seems kind of like a seductress. She's even trying to get Hector she's almost even trying to flirt with Hector a little bit. Oh, your brother is so useless. And so that is something to consider. One last thing that I want to mention is about the epic as a poetic form. Is oftentimes one of the ways I've mentioned that it's an oral storytelling tradition. Oftentimes one of the main conventions of an epic is that it always starts out with, of course I mentioned larger than life characters, so we're kind of moving back to the epic. But an epic poem always starts out with an invocation to a muse. Okay, the invocation to a muse. So the poet of an epic says, this poem, this subject is too large, right? This is a subject that's too large for one human imagination to consider, to think of. So I have to call on inspiration to help me out. I have to call on the gods, or later when we get to more Christian literature, I have to call on God, to inspire me to be able to discuss this subject, because this subject goes beyond our ability as storytellers to properly tell. So at the very beginning of book 1 of the Iliad, it says, "Rage, sing, goddess, Achilles' rage, black and murderous, that cost the Greeks incalculable pain, pitched countless souls of heroes into Hades' dark, and left their bodies to rot as feasts for dogs and birds as Zeus's will was done. Begin with the clash between Agamemnon, the Greek warlord, and godlike Achilles. Which of the immortals set these two at each other's throats?" Then it keeps going on and on. But we see here that the poet is calling on the goddess, the muse, to give the poet inspiration to even be able to tell the story, right? So that is a convention of an epic. This is a subject so large that it has to be inspired by something greater. But another great convention of an epic is called an epic simile. Lots of times in an epic, the poet will kind of stop. In an epic, the poet usually wants to take his time. describing the heroes, the characters. Lots of times, as a way of describing, the poet will kind of stop for a moment and compare the subject to something else. Like sometimes that comparison is meant to show, hey, this character is a badass. He's just like this other great character. Or it might just go to show, hey, this character is kind of absurd. And that's called an epic simile. A simile is, of course, a comparison. Our editors of our textbook were kind enough to give us a couple of those, but whenever they do, they put it in italics for you. One of the great ones in our section for today is right close to the end of Book 6 on page 255 of the PDF. It describes Paris returning to the scene of battle. It says, picture a horse that is fed on barley in a stall, breaking his halter and galloping across the plain and making for his accustomed swim in the river. A glorious animal, head held high, mane streaming like wind on his shoulders. Sure of his splendor, he prances by the horse runs and the mares in pasture. This was how Paris, son of Priam, came down from the high rock of Pergamenum, gleaming like amber and laughing in his armor, and his feet were fast. So this just kind of goes to show that Paris is this he's this vain man, right? Who is like a proud horse galloping in the battle, right? It's a nice sort of image that gives some character to Paris by comparing him to a proud horse, right? It's meant to be funny, but meant to also show how absurd Paris is. So that's an epic simile. In an epic, it's when the poet stops for a moment. He says, this person is like this thing or this other person. So that's an epic simile. That's something to keep up with as you read. Like I said, their editors are kind enough to put them in italics for you. So those are some themes of the Iliad. That's a little bit about the epic as a form. As you continue reading it before the next video, other things to keep these ideas in mind. Who is the hero? What's the role of war? Right? Who is Achilles heroic? All these questions keep in mind as you keep on doing your reading. So I guess hope you guys enjoyed this video introducing you to the poem. I will make another as soon as I continue my reading myself. I'm reading right along with you. So until next time, take care, guys. Enjoy this great poem.